Chapter 2357 Untitled. Chapter 2357 Untitled. After they carried old Mrs. Long out of the room, they all looked at Feng Wu. Look. Lady Gu pointed at Feng Wu's hands. She has. She stopped mid-sentence. Feng Wu should be holding a piece of cloth that was torn off Mrs. Gu's clothes, but it wasn't there. Luckily, Lady Gu stopped before she blurted it out. Otherwise, her plan would be exposed. What do I have? Feng Wu rose to her feet and looked calmly at Lady Gu. Meanwhile, everyone was watching Feng Wu. Some were furious and others were confused. Lady Gu said, "You killed Mrs. Gu." Feng Wu showed everyone her hands. "No, I didn't." Lady Gu said, "Then how did she die? You and she were the only two people here, and she's lying in a pool of blood now." Feng Wu smirked and glanced at the bed. Behind the bed curtain was Jun Linshan. Feng Wu walked over to the bed and opened the white curtain. "Why is Prince Jun Linshan here?" many people cried out. Things were getting more and more confusing. Feng Wu kicked Jun Linshan and said, "Hey, get up!" The crowd was speechless when they saw how rudely Feng Wu treated the prince. Even if Jun Linshan wasn't as popular as Jun Linyuan, he was still a prince. How could Feng Wu kick him? Jun Linshan's lashes fluttered, and he opened his eyes. To be frank, Jun Linshan was a handsome young man. He looked a little delirious when he opened his eyes. He murmured, "Feng Wu." The crowd was shocked. He sounded drugged. Prince Jun Linshan and Feng Wu. Women were very sensitive to such things, especially Tao Qingqing, who was in love with Jun Linshan. She thought she knew what had happened and was furious. Jun Linshan struggled to sit up. He then grabbed Feng Wu's hand and said, "You sent me a note, asking me to meet you here. What did you feed me? Why do I feel a little dizzy?" Sss. Everyone drew in their breath. Did Feng Wu drug the prince? Why are there so many people here? Jun Linshan wrapped his robe around his shoulders. Suddenly, his eyes widened. Because he saw Mrs. Gu, who was lying in a pool of blood. Isn't that Mrs. Gu? What happened to her? Jun Linshan stared at Feng Wu. "You told me to go to sleep while you went to take care of something. Was that it? Did you go to kill Mrs. Gu?" The crowd was astonished. They hadn't been convinced that Feng Wu was the killer at first, but after Jun Linshan woke up, everything he said suggested that Feng Wu had killed the lady. Lady Gu stared at Feng Wu. "What other excuses do you have now?" Mrs. Zwa said, "Feng Wu, you're really having an affair with the prince and you killed Mrs. Gu to silence her." Lady Wang seemed panic-stricken. She grabbed Feng Wu's hands and said nervously, "What should we do now? Xiao Wu, just confess your crime." Chapter 2358 Untitled. Chapter 2358 Untitled. Feng Wu knew what these people wanted. But even if she had done it, she still wouldn't confess, not to mention that she really hadn't done anything wrong. Feng Wu's gaze swept over the crowd. Lady Gu was furious, Lady Wang was gloating, Mrs. Dugu watched in silence, and old Mrs. Gu couldn't wait for her to die. Feng Wu smiled a little. "I didn't kill Mrs. Gu." Lady Gu said, "Yes, you did." Feng Wu shrugged. "Why would I do that?" Lady Gu said, "Because she saw what you did with Prince Jun Linshan." Feng Wu looked at her. "What did I do with the prince?" Lady Gu said, "The prince just admitted it. Stop lying." She then turned to Jun Linshan. "Your Royal Highness, why are you here?" Jun Linshan looked from Lady Gu to Feng Wu and hesitated. Lady Gu glared at him. "Your Royal Highness, if you don't come clean, you'll be a suspect as well." After some hesitation, Jun Linshan said, "Xiao Wu asked to meet me here." Feng Wu denied it. "No, I didn't." Hearing that, Jun Linshan glared at Feng Wu. "Why would I come here alone?" As he spoke, he took out a piece of paper and handed it to old Mrs. Gu. Old Mrs. Gu darted a dirty look at Feng Wu before unfolding the paper. It was a love letter. It asked June Linshan to come here, and although the handwriting was almost illegible, one could still tell that it was from Feng Wu. Old Mrs. Gu handed the paper to Mrs. Zhou while she stared at Feng Wu with her cold gaze. Feng Wu, what do you have to say about this? Feng Wu shrugged. I never asked him to come here. Old Mrs. Gu smirked. Who wrote the letter then? Feng Wu said, It wasn't me. Granny Zhu reminded old Mrs. Gu, my lady, we found a schedule on Miss Feng Wu earlier. It has her handwriting on it. Old Mrs. Gu nodded. That's right. We can compare the two. Mrs. Zhou pointed at Mrs. Dugu. Mrs. Dugu knows handwriting well. Even Her Majesty the Empress Dowager appreciates her talent. She can have a look for us. Old Mrs. Gu said, Mrs. Dugu, please help us. Mrs. Dugu said, My lady, it'll be my pleasure. I'm glad that I can help find Mrs. Gu's killer. While Mrs. Dugu compared the handwriting, Lady Gu took out a handkerchief and covered Mrs. Gu's face. Everyone waited for Mrs. Dugu's conclusion. She didn't keep the others waiting. In less than 5 minutes, she was done. The 2 notes are written by the same person, said Mrs. Dugu solemnly. Look at these strokes. They have to be from the same hand. Old Mrs. Gu glared at Feng Wu. Here's your proof. Feng Wu was about to say something when old Mrs. Gu waved at some guards. Take her down and lock her up. Chapter 2359 Untitled. Chapter 2359 Untitled. After they locked her up, they could do whatever they wanted with her. Wait. When 2 guards walked toward Feng Wu, she stopped them. Even if I did write that letter, it can't prove that I killed Mrs. Gu. Lady Gu said, Although it can't prove that you're the killer, it still proves that you're an unchaste woman. You're courting His Royal Highness the Crown Prince and Prince June Linshan at the same time. You're a humiliation to the Feng clan. Do you know how you'll affect your cousin's reputation? Tao Qingqing finally had her chance. She bellowed, Feng Wu. I've finally caught you. You shameless woman. Feng Wu ignored her and only asked June Linshan, My prince, what do you think? June Linshan looked embarrassed. Finally, he took Tao Qingqing's hand and said apologetically, Xiao Wu, I'm so sorry, but Qingqing is the one I want to marry. I won't accept you no matter what drug you fed me. Tao Qingqing was greatly satisfied with the public acknowledgement. She grabbed June Linshan's hand and cried, Did she drug you? With what? June Linshan rubbed his forehead and seemed frustrated. Tao Qingqing checked his pulse. She then cried out, Feng Wu drugged you with an aphrodisiac. Whoosh! Immediately, all eyes were on Feng Wu. How could Feng Wu do such a thing? Did she do the same to the Crown Prince? She must have. Otherwise, why would His Royal Highness like her? I didn't know that she was this sort of person. I thought she changed, and I started to like her. How disappointing! Tao Qingqing glared at Feng Wu and snorted. Feng Wu, do you want men so desperately? Do you have to steal other people's fiancés? You just can't spend a night alone, can you? Hearing all the discussion, Feng Wu smirked. She asked June Linshan, Aren't you tired? June Linshan asked, What are you talking about? Feng Wu said, Aren't you tired of all the acting? June Linshan's stomach lurched. Feng Wu shook her head. I was going to show some respect for His Majesty's sake and not ruin your reputation, but you just won't stop. I can't help you anymore. Everyone was astonished. What did that mean? Shouldn't Feng Wu be in a fluster, after all that was said about her? But she was threatening the prince now. Was there something behind it? Somehow, June Linshan panicked a little. He bellowed, What on earth are you talking about? Take this killer. Feng Wu then looked at Mrs. Dugu. Are you so sure that I was the one who wrote that letter? Mrs. Dugu also had a bad feeling. She was alarmed. Chapter 2360 Untitled. Chapter 2360 Untitled. Mrs. Dugu was a smart woman. She and Feng Wu weren't archenemies. There was no need for her to drag herself into things. She gave it some thought and said carefully, "There's no direct evidence to suggest that you were the one who wrote the letter." Old Mrs. Gu glared at Mrs. Dugu. Mrs. Dugu said, "But it's certain that the letter was written by the same person who wrote that schedule." Feng Wu said, "Are you sure?" Mrs. Dugu said, "Absolutely." Feng Wu chuckled. "But I didn't write the schedule." Feng Wu was incriminated because of the letter. It was believed that she killed Mrs. Gu because the lady had walked in on her secret meeting with Jun Linshan. The logic would only work if Feng Wu had really written the letter. "But now," she said calmly, "I didn't write that schedule. Therefore, I couldn't have written the letter." Jun Linshan snorted. "Of course you would say that. Why should we believe you? Did Qiuling write it, then? You can't blame everything on your maid." Feng Wu smiled. "No, it wasn't Qiuling." Jun Linshan said, "Who was it then?" Feng Wu grinned. "Your Royal Highness, be careful what you wish for." Jun Linshan glared at Feng Wu and had a bad feeling. He suddenly felt that he had missed something very important. Feng Wu said, "Take a closer look at that paper." The paper. Jun Linshan picked up the letter and examined it. There was nothing wrong with it. He then nervously examined the schedule. Tao Qingqing frowned. She held Jun Linshan's hand and tried to take away the letter. "Why are you listening to her? Don't believe her." Jun Linshan pushed her away. This wasn't the first time that Jun Linshan had confronted Feng Wu. Apart from Jun Linyuan, she was the person he feared the most. Every time he thought he was going to win in the past, Feng Wu would humiliate him. Jun Linshan was scared. The others all thought that Feng Wu was lying, but when they saw how serious Jun Linshan was, they became nervous as well. They all stared at the schedule in Jun Linshan's hands. "If you can't see it," Feng Wu crossed her hands behind her back and smiled. "Touch it then." Tao Qingqing glared at Jun Linshan. She thought that Jun Linshan wouldn't listen to Feng Wu. But Jun Linshan disappointed her. He started feeling the paper like Feng Wu said. There was nothing at first. Suddenly, he froze. His eyes widened. Everyone saw the change in his expression. They wondered what had happened. Jun Linshan glared at Feng Wu as if he was trying to peel her skin off. Chapter 2361 Untitled. Chapter 2361 Untitled. Jun Linshan wanted to say something but only managed to utter a single word. "What's wrong?" Mrs. Dugu was frightened by the look on his face. "Your Royal Highness, is there something wrong with the schedule?" Feng Wu smiled. "When we were in the grassland, His Majesty heard about my daily schedule and said that he would punish me if I couldn't do everything I said I would. As proof, he wrote down the schedule himself." "What? His Majesty wrote it himself? His Majesty? That's impossible." Mrs. Dugu pointed at the paper. "Why would His Majesty write something like this? It's complete nonsense." Feng Wu didn't retort. She only smiled at Jun Linshan until it gave him the creeps. Since everyone was looking at Feng Wu, when she smiled at Jun Linshan, the others all looked at Jun Linshan in bewilderment as well. Jun Linshan felt his stomach sink. He couldn't answer that question. Because he couldn't afford the consequences. He grabbed the schedule and wanted to tear it up. Feng Wu beamed at him. Only someone with a guilty conscience would want to destroy the evidence. She was suggesting that Jun Linshan would only incriminate himself if he destroyed the paper. Jun Linshan glared at Feng Wu. Feng Wu chuckled. "Plus, His Majesty will remember that he wrote it. I don't think he'll be very happy if he knows that you tore up his work." Hearing that, Jun Linshan didn't know what to do. Everyone was murmuring among themselves. "What is that schedule? What secret does it contain? If His Majesty really did write that schedule, then the so-called handwritten letter from Feng Wu, that meant that someone was trying to frame her. Everyone looked at Jun Linshan. Only he knew the truth. Tao Qingqing grew anxious. She grabbed Jun Linshan and shouted, "Your Royal Highness, just deny it! How could His Majesty have written this? Just say no and we'll believe you." Jun Linshan wanted to kill her. What an idiot! Couldn't she see the situation he was in? What she said only made it worse. Meanwhile, many people were filled with doubts. Even those who had believed Feng Wu to be the murderer began to have second thoughts. Jun Linshan racked his brain. If it was proven that the schedule had been written by his father, it would indirectly prove that he had been lying. And if a prince was believed to be a liar, it was worse than being mediocre. Hence, when he made up his mind to tear up the schedule, he suddenly felt a cold gaze on him. Someone seemed to be watching him from half a city away. His mind wandered for a brief moment. When he returned to himself, "His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince is here." Those words woke him up. The crowd stirred. "His Royal Highness is here. I thought His Royal Highness was in seclusion and wouldn't see anyone. Why is he here?" Chapter 2362, Untitled. Chapter 2362, Untitled. His Royal Highness accepted the Gu family's invitation. That's how important the Gu family is. Lord Gu, who had stayed behind the scenes until then, welcomed Jun Linyuan into the room. As soon as Jun Linyuan walked in, the crowd parted, making way for him. Jun Linyuan looked very elegant in his fox fur coat. He had always been an outstanding figure. Light seemed to follow him wherever he went. Around him, everyone fell into the background. He looked like the only star in the sky. Jun Linyuan was more impressive than he usually was. The moment he walked in, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and everyone fell silent. No one even dared to look up at him. The young man was unapproachable. Ever since he walked in, Jun Linyuan had kept his unblinking gaze on Feng Wu. There was an eager look in his eyes. Feng Wu's stomach lurched. Somehow, that look made her uneasy. Jun Linyuan walked up to her and cast a stern look at her. Feng Wu stumbled back involuntarily. The Crown Prince reached out and pulled Feng Wu into his arms. Feng Wu whimpered when her nose bumped into his chest. Jun Linyuan bent down and whispered something in her ear. Feng Wu stiffened when she heard what he said. Because he said, "I'll break your leg if you try to approach another man." Feng Wu glared at him. What was that supposed to mean? There was no other man. Wait, that wasn't it. He had no right to say such things to her. Feng Wu would have retorted on any other day, but Jun Linyuan felt exceedingly unapproachable today. She felt intimidated. The Crown Prince only turned away after staring at Feng Wu for several seconds. And he became even more intimidating after he turned around. No one dared to meet his gaze. He was without a doubt the most talented man of his age. He was more talented than many teenagers put together. Even Jun Linshan was chilled to the bone by the energy Jun Linyuan gave off. He seemed to be cold to Feng Wu, but it was nothing compared with how he treated other people. Jun Linyuan snatched the schedule from Jun Linshan. Only then did Jun Linshan jump up in fright. He glared at Jun Linyuan and wanted to take it back, but he realized in frustration that he didn't dare to say a word. The Crown Prince frowned after he glanced at the schedule. He then asked Jun Linshan, "What's this print?" Jun Linshan gritted his teeth. He had had to search for it for a very long time, but Jun Linyuan saw it at first glance. Chapter 2363, Untitled. Chapter 2363, Untitled. However, he didn't dare question Jun Linyuan openly. He wanted to play the tough guy, but he had a feeling that if he did that, Jun Linyuan would choke him in front of everyone. Before Jun Linyuan arrived, Jun Linshan had been the most powerful man in the room, and everyone had to listen to him. But his status had been reduced significantly after Jun Linyuan arrived. He didn't dare talk back to his brother no matter what he said. Jun Linshan said gingerly, "I understand." Jun Linyuan grinned and glanced at him. "What do you understand?" Jun Linshan knew that Jun Linyuan was on Feng Wu's side. Now that Jun Linyuan had the schedule, Jun Linshan felt that he should have revealed the truth first. Despite the hatred that filled his heart, he couldn't let it show. Jun Linshan remained silent. Jun Linyuan didn't press him. He looked back at Feng Wu and whispered in her ear, "I told you I could help you." Feng Wu didn't know what to say. He was so intimidating a minute ago, but what was he doing now? "Beg me," Jun Linyuan whispered. "Beg me and I'll help you." Feng Wu glared at him. What was this man doing? Jun Linyuan had his back to the crowd, but Feng Wu could see their faces. She could see how much Jun Linyuan terrified them. The fear was in their bones. He was like a god of death to them. Even Lord Gu and old Mrs. Gu had to bow their heads. That was how important Jun Linyuan was. No one could challenge him. But now, he was asking Feng Wu if she needed his help. Feng Wu glared at him. What a... He only asked her that after he made his grand entrance and terrified everyone. One word from him, and all her problems would be solved, but Feng Wu didn't want to see his gloating smile. Feng Wu snorted. "I don't need your help." The Crown Prince glanced at Feng Wu. "Are you sure?" Feng Wu pushed him away. "I can handle it myself." Jun Linyuan nodded. He glanced at Feng Wu and smiled. Feng showed up out of nowhere with a chair. The Crown Prince sat down, rested his chin on his hand, and looked at Feng Wu in expectation. From Tao Qingqing's angle, she could see Jun Linyuan's smile when he spoke to Feng Wu. She couldn't believe what she saw. She rubbed her eyes and found that the Crown Prince was as handsome as ever. But there was passion in his eyes when he looked at Feng Wu. Was the Crown Prince actually as relentless as he seemed? She immediately said, "Your Royal Highness, Feng Wu asked Prince Jun Linshan here to spend the night with her. She's an unchaste woman." 1. There was a loud thump before Tao Qingqing could finish. Chapter 2364 Untitled. Chapter 2364 Untitled. Jun Linyuan punched Tao Qingqing in the chest, and she flew backward. Thump! Tao Qingqing knocked over many tables and chairs before she smashed into the wall. She fell to the ground and spat out a mouthful of blood. Everyone was astonished. They didn't dare to look at the Crown Prince, so they could only stare at Tao Qingqing. What a strike! Lady Gu and Lady Wang looked at each other. Old Mrs. Gu frowned and Mrs. Zhua had clenched her fists so hard that her fingernails were digging into her palms. They all had a bad feeling. Mrs. Zhua had been giving Feng Wu trouble for quite some time, but she had never seen the Crown Prince like this before. She tried to convince herself that she was mistaken. Deep down, however, she knew that the Crown Prince had feelings for Feng Wu. "Qingluan, you shouldn't be so confident in yourself. Stop traveling around and come back." Mrs. Zhua gritted her teeth and thought to herself. She really was getting anxious. Tao Qingqing was the most confused of them all. She never saw it coming. She was the daughter of the Tao family, and was used to an indulgent life. Feng Wu was only a useless daughter of a declining family. How could the Crown Prince do this? Tao Qingqing was so frustrated that she wanted to cry, but she then saw Jun Linyuan's eyes. What a pair of eyes! There was no warmth in them. Under his gaze, Tao Qingqing felt like an ant crawling on the ground. She knew that he wouldn't hesitate to kill her, because his eyes were filled with contempt. But he didn't look at Feng Wu like that. Tao Qingqing was so scared that she wept in silence. Jun Linyuan ignored Tao Qingqing after that and kept his unblinking gaze on Feng Wu. He couldn't believe how good-looking she was. He couldn't look away from her. But he didn't know that he was already the center of attention and that people were watching his every move. Everything happened so fast after Tao Qingqing was smashed away. Feng Wu ignored her after that because Jun Linyuan had done that too many times already. Feng wanted to remind her that every time the Crown Prince did such a thing, it was for her. Feng Wu took the schedule from Jun Linyuan and looked around. She then found a charcoal crayon on the desk. She began to smear the charcoal on the paper. Soon a print appeared. It was the mark made by a jade seal. Feng Wu smiled at Jun Linshan. Are you still not going to admit it? Jun Linshan gritted her teeth. What can this mark prove? Feng Wu smiled. It can prove that the paper came from His Majesty's desk. Are you going to say that I can't prove that His Majesty wrote it? Actually, I can. Feng Wu pointed at Jun Linyuan. He was there. He's my witness. Jun Linshan glared at Feng Wu. Jun Linyuan leaned back in the chair and gave Feng Wu a half-smile. Chapter 2365 Jun Linyuan is amazing. Chapter 2365 Jun Linyuan is amazing. Jun Linyuan decided that if she wanted him to be her witness, she had to beg him. And he made sure that Feng Wu saw it in his eyes. Feng Wu didn't know what to say. She felt that Jun Linyuan was like a child asking for a reward. She nodded at him, indicating that she would owe him one. Only then did the Crown Prince nod at the crowd, admitting that he really had seen it. That was all Feng Wu needed as her proof. No matter how hard Jun Linshan stared at her, the crowd still believed the Crown Prince. That was the ultimate proof. Mrs. Dugu immediately paled. Because she was the one who had concluded that Feng Wu's schedule and the letter were written by the same person. If His Majesty really had written that schedule, what about the letter? That would mean that His Majesty had written that as well. That was just ridiculous. Mrs. Dugu's face went ghastly pale. She swayed and looked like she was about to faint. Mrs. Zwa steadied her in time before she fell. Mrs. Dugu gave her a pleading look. But Mrs. Zwa was as flustered as she was. They never expected that Feng Wu would do such a thing, let alone that the schedule had been written by the Emperor. Moreover, the Crown Prince had arrived in time to prove it for Feng Wu. Calm down, Mrs. Zwa was talking to both Mrs. Dugu and herself. Old Mrs. Gu, Lady Wang, Mrs. Dugu and Mrs. Zwa were in it together. Jun Linshan had joined them as well. They hadn't believed that Feng Wu would be able to talk her way out of this mess. Feng Wu looked at each of the ladies in turn before fixing her gaze on Jun Linshan. My prince, are you still so sure that I was the one who invited you here? On any normal day, Jun Linshan would have insisted that the letter was from Feng Wu. However, he hesitated under Jun Linyuan's gaze. He glanced at Jun Linyuan and smiled. Even so, it can only prove that Mrs. Dugu made a mistake. It can't prove that you never wrote the letter. Feng Wu suddenly chuckled. I see that you really are very confident in yourself. She rolled her eyes at him. Do you think you're more handsome than His Royal Highness? Jun Linshan's face went scarlet red, and he refused to answer. Jun Linyuan stared at him. Answer her. Jun Linshan was dumbfounded. But seeing Jun Linyuan's threatening gaze, he had to answer. No, I'm not. Feng Wu nodded and asked, What about your talent? Are you more talented than he is? Jun Linshan was dumbfounded. This girl was asking him the most humiliating questions. He refused to answer. However, Jun Linyuan shifted in his chair and glanced at Jun Linshan again. Jun Linshan took a deep breath and gritted his teeth. No, I'm not. Feng Wu chuckled. Do you think you're more popular than him, then? Jun Linshan was speechless. No one could be more popular than Jun Linyuan. Feng Wu chuckled again. Are you more influential than him? Chapter 2366 Untitled. Chapter 2366. Untitled. Jun Linshan stared at Feng Wu. Of course he couldn't compare with the Crown Prince in terms of power. So, he shook his head again. Feng Wu glanced at him and said, "If you're not as handsome, talented, powerful, or popular as Jun Linyuan, why?" she asked sarcastically, "why would I choose you over him?" Boom! Those words sounded like a thunderclap in everyone's ears. She was right. The Crown Prince was better than Jun Linshan in every way. Feng Wu wasn't stupid. Why would she choose Jun Linshan over the Crown Prince? Jun Linshan's face turned even redder. He felt that he had been slapped over and over again in front of Jun Linyuan. And Feng Wu didn't stop there. She said sarcastically, "Even if I wanted to meet someone in the middle of the night, it would be His Royal Highness, and he would be the one I would drug as well. Who on earth do you think you are? Wretch." Jun Linshan was so angry that he spat out a mouthful of blood. He was so angry. Not all things were voiced. For instance, everybody knew that Jun Linshan wasn't as good as Jun Linyuan, but no one would say it out loud, at least not in front of Jun Linshan. But Feng Wu wasn't just anyone. She would never try to save face for other people. She had never liked Jun Linshan, and after he tried to set her up, she would do her best to destroy him. Therefore, she humiliated him in front of Jun Linyuan. Tao Qingqing felt so sorry for Jun Linshan. She was Jun Linshan's fiancée now, so of course, she was on Jun Linshan's side. She stepped out and shouted at Feng Wu, "That's nonsense." Hearing that, Mrs. Zwa didn't feel so full of despair anymore. They all looked expectantly at Tao Qingqing, hoping that she could turn things around. Tao Qingqing stared at Feng Wu and smirked. "I admit that you're right to some extent. Prince Jun Linshan is inferior to His Royal Highness in many aspects, but I can say the same thing of just about every teenager." Everyone nodded. She was right. Jun Linyuan was like a god. No one could compare with him. No one is as amazing as His Royal Highness. Making such a comparison would only humiliate them. Miss Tao is right. Jun Linshan felt a little bit better when he heard that. Tao Qingqing stared at Feng Wu and said, "But I don't believe the rest of what you said." Feng Wu asked, "And why is that?" Tao Qingqing said, "You said that you wouldn't choose Prince Jun Linshan over the Crown Prince. Do you know what you're suggesting? You're telling us that the Crown Prince will choose you." Chapter 2367 Untitled. Chapter 2367 Untitled. Tao Qingqing looked from Feng Wu to the Crown Prince, and it was obvious that she wasn't convinced. Meanwhile, everyone was watching Feng Wu as well. They were waiting for her reaction. Even Jun Linyuan was looking at Feng Wu with his chin resting on his hand. Feng Wu didn't know what to say. She felt that she had just dug her own grave. Everyone was urging her with their eyes, asking her to prove that Jun Linyuan would accept her. Feng Wu drew in a breath. She decided to take a risk to prove her innocence. She turned around and sat on Jun Linyuan's lap. Before the others could react, she wrapped her arms around his neck. Everyone was astonished. They felt like they had been struck by lightning. They couldn't believe their eyes. How could this be happening? OMG! Wasn't the Crown Prince supposed to be a neat freak, and couldn't stand it when women were within a meter of him? Not only was Feng Wu sitting on the Crown Prince's lap, she was also hugging him. "Please push her away. Please." All the ladies were staring at Jun Linyuan's hands, hoping that he would push Feng Wu away. But the Crown Prince. His face remained expressionless, but there was a passionate look in his eyes when he spoke to Feng Wu. "Are you using me now?" he whispered in her ear. Feng Wu stiffened a little, but when she heard Jun Linyuan's provoking tone, she decided that she wouldn't give in. She had been a secret agent in her previous life, and had learned all there was to know about seducing men. She moved closer and breathed into his ear. "Yes, I'm using you. Do I have your consent?" She was so close that Jun Linyuan stiffened. He still had that arrogant look on his face, but his earlobes had turned red. It gave him a rather alluring look. The two of them were so close that in other people's eyes, they were already kissing. Before the others could react, Feng Wu had risen to her feet again. Although it lasted for just a few seconds, it was enough to shock everyone. Feng Wu rested her hands on her waist and looked around the crowd. As expected, all her enemies looked utterly beaten. She looked back and forth between Jun Linshan and Tao Qingqing, making them grit their teeth. In the end, Feng Wu raised her chin and said to Tao Qingqing, "Are you convinced now?" Tao Qingqing trembled in rage. She was jealous as well. Feng Wu gloated. "Now you know that His Royal Highness will pick me." Tao Qingqing glared at her. Feng Wu jabbed a finger in Tao Qingqing's chest repeatedly, making her stumble back. "Why would I choose Jun Linshan when I already have His Royal Highness? If you have a brain, use it." Chapter 2368 Untitled. Chapter 2368 Untitled. Feng Wu loved this feeling. Tao Qingqing was speechless. Feng Wu said, "You can have Jun Linshan all to yourself. He's your treasure, not mine." Tao Qingqing was speechless. She had never felt so humiliated. Jun Linshan glared at Tao Qingqing. Had it not been for her, he wouldn't have to endure Feng Wu's humiliation for so long. "Mrs. Tao grabbed Tao Qingqing and apologized to Feng Wu. She apologized for her rude daughter and said that she would discipline her when they went back home. Feng Wu had never been the unreasonable type. She only targeted Tao Qingqing because the latter had targeted her. Since Mrs. Tao had apologized and Tao Qingqing looked crestfallen after her defeat, Feng Wu decided to cut her loose. She turned to Jun Linshan instead. "So, my prince, are you still insisting that I drugged you and tried to seduce you?" Jun Linshan had thought that Feng Wu would be an easy target, but as it turned out, she was one of the toughest opponents he had ever met. By then, he had accepted his defeat. Hearing the question, he shook his head. "No, of course not. I'm sure it's just a big misunderstanding." Feng Wu then turned to old Mrs. Gu. "So, can we rule out the possibility that I killed Mrs. Gu because she saw me having an affair with the prince?" The crown prince followed her gaze and stared at old Mrs. Gu as well. Despite her seeming calm, old Mrs. Gu was deeply shaken. She had also thought that Feng Wu would be an easy target, but the girl had claws. She wanted to get rid of the girl as soon as possible, so she smiled wryly and said, "That's right. It was just a big misunderstanding. I'm sure that Miss Feng Wu had nothing to do with it." The old lady now wanted Feng Wu and the crown prince out of her sight. However, Feng Wu wouldn't leave. She pulled over a chair and sat down next to Jun Linyuan. "I'm not going anywhere until I figure out what happened." Old Mrs. Gu wanted to throttle Feng Wu. Why would this girl try to stir things up again when she was ready to drop the whole thing? Just then, they heard a cold voice. "No one is going anywhere until we figure out what happened." It was old Mrs. Long. Next to her was a man. It was Long Yenny, the master of Dragon Valley. Mrs. Gu was his sister. Old Mrs. Long only had a daughter and a son, and the siblings were close. Long Yenny was here today not only to celebrate the old lady's birthday, but also to see his little sister. But he never imagined that it would be the last time he saw his sister alive. Lady Gu's stomach lurched and she looked at old Mrs. Gu. Things were getting out of hand. If they failed to incriminate Feng Wu, and the Long family found out the truth, the Gu family were doomed. Lady Gu stared at Feng Wu. "You shouldn't be going anywhere. We haven't ruled you out as the suspect yet." Feng Wu chuckled. "Really? Enlighten me then. What's my motive?" Chapter 2369 Untitled. Chapter 2369 Untitled. Lady Gu snorted. Your mother is your motive. Feng Wu's mother was the legendary Lady Ling, who was said to be the most beautiful woman on the continent. The beautiful lady was Feng Wu's taboo, just like her beautiful master. Therefore, Feng Wu was filled with rage when Lady Gu brought up her mother's name in front of everyone. Lady Gu knew that if Feng Wu remained alive, the Gu family would be doomed, so she had to destroy Feng Wu. She glared at Feng Wu and said, "Lady Ling wants to marry Lord Gu." Wow! Everyone gave Feng Wu strange looks. Seriously? Lady Ling and Lord Gu? Really? If Lady Ling really is in love with Lord Gu, of course, the Lord would want her. She's so beautiful. But Lord Gu has a wife, so he can't officially marry her. Since you're ambitious enough to marry the crown prince, of course, you can't stand the idea of your mother becoming a concubine. You planned the whole thing. You invited Prince Jun Linshan here and made sure that we thought we'd wronged you. After that, we wouldn't suspect you again. But you're the real killer and His Royal Highness is on your side. Lady Gu then turned to Jun Linyuan. Your Royal Highness, please open your eyes. She's lying to you. Wow! What Lady Gu said was so incredible that everyone was baffled. It was too terrifying to be true. Did Feng Wu really plan the whole thing? Things had just taken another turn. Everyone began to suspect Feng Wu again. They even doubted Jun Linyuan's decision. If the crown prince would protect such a girl, they wouldn't respect him as much. Lady Gu had made up such an elaborate story that she had convinced even herself. Only then could she convince the others. At the same time, people in the palace were already told what had happened in the manor. What? Emperor Wu had yet to digest the news that Feng Wu had defeated Jun Linshan, but now the story had changed again. Lady Ling and Lord Gu? The Empress Dowager was furious when she heard that Jun Linyuan was protecting Feng Wu. Ranmil was angry as well. Empress Dugu was the most upset of them all. Compared with Jun Linyuan, Jun Linshan was just a mediocre prince, but Empress Dugu wouldn't accept the reality, and had been urging her son to compete with the crown prince. But Feng Wu had humiliated Jun Linshan in front of so many people. Jun Linshan had been forced to admit that he was inferior to Jun Linyuan, which would be such a blow to his confidence. It pained Empress Dugu to think about it. She took Emperor Wu's hand and wept. Your Majesty, how could Feng Wu say such things to Linshan? Emperor Wu thought, she's telling the truth, isn't she? However, he knew that it would only make Empress Dugu whine, so he nodded and said, I'll tell her off next time she's here. Chapter 2370 Untitled. Chapter 2370 Untitled. Emperor Wu had already received news about what happened at Imperial College, and found the girl amazing. She was as defiant as Jun Linyuan, but all geniuses had tempers. Emperor Wu was very tolerant toward Feng Wu now, and treated her as he did Jun Linyuan. Deep down, he already considered her his daughter-in-law. Therefore, he couldn't stand it when Empress Dugu criticized Feng Wu. But it just so happened that they were given the news about Lady Ling and Lord Gu. Empress Dugu was so excited that she almost jumped to her feet. Your Majesty, did you hear that? She tugged at Emperor Wu's sleeve. That Lady Ling did such a despicable thing. I can just imagine what kind of daughter she brought up. They're both the worst women. Poor Mrs. Gu. However, those words made Emperor Wu snap. Shut up, he bellowed. Lady Ling is the most graceful lady on this continent. She's beyond any mortal man. She would never set her eyes on a man like Gu Guanjuan. Emperor Wu was furious. Of course he was. Lady Ling was the most beautiful lady on this continent. It was only natural that Emperor Wu fancied her. She was like a goddess to him. But all he dared to do was watch her from afar. But now, damn you, Gu Guanjuan, even I can't bring myself to do anything. How dare you harm her reputation? To Emperor Wu, No woman was as precious as the lady. Empress Dugu had no idea what Emperor Wu was thinking. Little did she know that to Emperor Wu, the lady with the mind of a 7-year-old was more valuable than anything. Empress Dugu went on complaining. Your Majesty, Feng Wu's father disappeared when she was little and is probably dead by now. Having lived by herself for so many years, Lady Ling must be lonely, so she seduced Lord Gu. Shut up! Emperor Wu was furious and bellowed at Empress Dugu. Did you see it with your own eyes? Baffled, Empress Dugu tried to explain. I mean if. Emperor Wu was infuriated. As a woman, you should know how important a woman's reputation is, but you're helping those people spread rumors. I must have been blind when I made you Empress. That was a very serious thing to say. Was he going to remove her title as Empress? Empress Dugu was scared out of her wits. She dropped to her knees and burst into tears. Your Majesty, I didn't know what I was talking about. Please forgive me. In fact, she didn't know what she had done wrong. She had criticized other people in front of Emperor Wu before, but he had never lost his temper like this. Consort Ranmil, on the other hand, understood what it was about. Because of that, she clenched her fists and couldn't believe her eyes. The Empress Dowager spoke at that moment. Your Majesty, you're scaring the Empress. Emperor Wu kicked Empress Dugu away and headed for the door. The Empress Dowager asked, Your Majesty, where are you going? Emperor Wu said angrily, Gu Manor. Chapter 2371 Untitled. Chapter 2371 Untitled. Lady Gu had begun to make up stories. Do you think that Lady Ling is a chaste woman? That's just a mask she wears. In fact, Feng Wu would never allow anyone to slander her mother like that. She stepped out and raised her hand. Smack! She slapped Lady Gu hard in the face. Lady Gu stared at her in disbelief, and so did everyone else. They had never expected Feng Wu to hit a senior member of the family. Feng Wu, you! Before Lady Gu could protest, Feng Wu slapped her again. She used so much force that Lady Gu flew backward. The crowd was astonished. That was such a bold move. Some of them wanted to protest, but they gave up the idea when they saw the Crown Prince's face. Instead of shutting up, Lady Gu shouted even louder, as if she had lost her mind. You're angry because I'm telling the truth. She stared at Feng Wu and guffawed. I'll tell everyone even if you kill me. Feng Wu narrowed her eyes. She was about to speak when there were quick footsteps outside. His Majesty has arrived. Her Majesty the Empress has arrived. What? Everyone was astonished. Old Mrs. Gu and Lord Gu looked at each other in surprise. His Majesty. How could this be? They would already consider it a great blessing if Empress Dugu sent them a gift for the old lady's birthday, let alone have the Empress here in person. But now, even the Emperor was here. What was going on? Mrs. Zwa held old Mrs. Gu's hand and said excitedly, Empress Dugu must be here for Prince Jun Linshan. If the Empress was here to support Jun Linshan, then they would be able to stick to their lies. Mrs. Zwa then whispered, His Majesty and His Royal Highness don't really get along well. Old Mrs. Gu was reassured. They had been losing ground because Jun Linyuan supported Feng Wu. Now that His Majesty was here, the Crown Prince had to give way. At that thought, old Mrs. Gu and Lord Gu grew excited. Everyone knelt down to greet the Emperor and the Empress. Emperor Wu was obviously angry when he walked in, and the entire crowd could feel it. Your Majesty! Everyone greeted him. Wherever the Emperor went, the air felt thin. Even the temperature seemed to drop. He sat down in the host's seat and glanced at the crowd. Jun Linshan was very excited. He thought that his parents were here to support him because Jun Linyuan had crossed the line. At that thought, he jumped at Emperor Wu and said, Father, I didn't do it. Chapter 2372, Untitled. Chapter 2372, Untitled. Jun Linshan wrapped his arms around Emperor Wu's leg and shouted, "Your Majesty, I didn't do it." Feng Wu frowned at Emperor Wu. She remembered Emperor Wu as a biased father who would always take Jun Linshan's side. Was he going to do it again? Emperor Wu cast a stern look at Feng Wu and thought, "Aren't you a fierce girl? They're humiliating your mother now. Do something. Don't just sit around." Seeing that look, Feng Wu rubbed her nose and wondered what the emperor was up to this time. Emperor Wu had no idea that Feng Wu was mistaken about his attitude. He looked around and said, "Someone, tell me what's going on here." No one responded. Lady Gu suddenly had an idea. She decided that she should grab this opportunity and make the first move. At that thought, she stepped out and said loudly, "Your Majesty, Lady Ling is the one who started the whole thing. Your Majesty probably doesn't know who that is." Both Emperor Wu and Empress Dugu gave her a strange look. How could they not know who she was? Lady Gu spoke very fast when she was nervous. "Lady Ling seduced Lord Gu, my brother. Feng Wu wants her mother to become the official wife, so she killed Mrs. Gu." Emperor Wu gritted his teeth. "Did you say that Lady Ling seduced Gu Guanjuan?" Lady Gu was a little taken aback because she realized that something was off. The highlight of her analysis was the part where Feng Wu killed Mrs. Gu, but His Majesty only cared about the petty details, which puzzled Lady Gu. But she didn't have much time to think, so she nodded. "Yes, Lady Ling seduced Lord Gu." Emperor Wu gave Feng Wu a cold glance. He wondered why Feng Wu was still standing there when that woman was slandering her mother. Lady Gu cried and said, "Your Majesty, I'm telling the truth, but Feng Wu hit me. Please do something." Emperor Wu was satisfied when he saw the bruises on her face and her handless arm. Lady Gu would probably pass out if she knew what Emperor Wu was thinking. "Feng Wu, do you have anything to say?" Emperor Wu asked in a neutral tone. Feng Wu replied by slapping Lady Gu again. "I see that you haven't learned your lesson. Are you having fun making up stories? I'll slap you once for every lie you tell." She was dauntless. Everyone looked at her in disbelief. How dare she? How could she do that in front of the emperor? Lady Gu cried as she ran away from Feng Wu. "Your Majesty, Feng Wu is angry because I'm right." Seeing that Emperor Wu wouldn't say anything, Lady Gu screamed at Feng Wu, "How dare you hit me in front of His Majesty? You have no respect for His Majesty at all." Chapter 2373, Untitled. Chapter 2373, Untitled. Feng Wu smirked. She then took out the fire dragon rod and struck out at Lady Gu. "Go on shouting, I dare you." Most people wouldn't be able to withstand such force. Feng Wu aimed at Lady Gu's forehead. Luckily for Lady Gu, she evaded in time. The rod landed on her shoulder instead. Lady Gu cried out in pain. The crowd sucked in their breath. That thump sounded so painful. However, His Majesty didn't stop Feng Wu. Was His Majesty on Feng Wu's side? Old Mrs. Gu was furious. Lord Gu narrowed his eyes. However, the Long family reacted first. Long Yinny stopped the rod and glared at Feng Wu. "Stop!" He was the current head of the Long family. Around him, the temperature seemed to drop. All eyes fell on him. Emperor Wu watched this with a brooding look in his eyes. Jun Linyuan sat on his right and Empress Dugu on his left. Jun Linyuan was watching Feng Wu, and Empress Dugu was watching Emperor Wu. Empress Dugu had hoped that she had guessed wrong, but when she saw Emperor Wu give Feng Wu tacit consent to beat up Lady Gu, she knew that she couldn't lie to herself anymore. Emperor Wu had feelings for Lady Ling. Empress Dugu was both jealous and nervous at that discovery. Long Yinny didn't know any of this. He just kept staring at Feng Wu. "Did you kill my sister?" he asked. Feng Wu shook her head. "No. Long Yinny asked. Then how did she die? Feng Wu gave him a strange look and smiled a little. I'm afraid you'll have to ask Lord Gu. Long Yinny narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? He didn't have the patience for this. Then there was a sound. Someone sighed. The crowd turned around and saw that Lord Gu had stepped forward. All eyes were on him. Mrs. Gu was his wife, and the whole thing started because of his so-called relationship with Lady Ling. They were waiting for him to tell the truth. Now that he had stepped out, he was probably going to tell them what they wanted to hear. Everyone looked at him in expectation. Lord Gu walked up to Long Yinny and lowered his head. I do have to take responsibility for my wife's death. Master Long, you can do whatever you want with me. Long Yinny clenched his fist. Lord Gu said, Lady Ling has feelings for me, but I would never betray my wife, so I only promised her that she could become my concubine. However, I didn't know that she would. Chapter 2374 Untitled. Chapter 2374 Untitled. Lord Gu gave Feng Wu an odd look. The emotion it contained was a mixture of rage, hatred, and resignation. In the end, he took a deep breath and sighed. He sounded very sorry when he spoke to Long Yinny. You can take revenge however you like. The Gu family will take full responsibility. Success. Everyone drew in their breaths when they heard that. Although Lord Gu didn't name the killer, the look he gave Feng Wu revealed the truth. So, did Feng Wu really kill Mrs. Gu for her mother? Emperor Wu was furious, and the temperature seemed to drop again. There was a murderous look in his eyes. Gu Guanzhuan's stomach lurched. Why? Empress Dugu gloated at Gu Guanzhuan's predicament. Long Yinny gritted his teeth and asked, So, you're saying that this girl killed my sister? Gu Guanzhuan sounded pained when he said, She's too young to understand what she has done. I'm the reason why this happened. I'll take full responsibility. The crowd was moved by what he said. Some of them had been doubtful before, thinking that even if Feng Wu was the killer, Lord Gu had to have something to do with it as well. However, they admired Lord Gu after hearing what he said. Feng Wu looked at Gu Guanzhuan and found him to be the most cunning man. Are you going to take responsibility? Feng Wu smiled at him. Since you're the murderer, Lord Gu, you should pay with your life. The others were all baffled. Why did she say that? After everything that had happened, how could she still sound so confident? Gu Guanzhuan was perplexed. He didn't expect to hear such words from Feng Wu either. He looked at her and sighed in disappointment. You're too proud. If you can do such a thing at your age, what will you become when you grow up? I was going to protect you because of your promising future, but since you won't repent, you're on your own. Feng Wu, admit your crime. Long Yinny reached for Feng Wu's neck. He was going to execute her. As soon as he raised his hand, the crown prince's eyes glinted coldly. Thump! Long Yinny stumbled back, and the ground under Jun Linyuan's chair cracked as well. He glared at Jun Linyuan. Jun Linyuan was in the younger generation, and Long Yinny was his senior. Normally, a teenager would never be the match of a middle-aged man. Moreover, Long Yinny was the master of Dragon Valley and a talented cultivator. However, after exchanging one blow, he realized that he wasn't Jun Linyuan's match. Chapter 2375 Untitled. Chapter 2375 Untitled. Not only wasn't he Jun Linyuan's match, he also couldn't tell what Jun Linyuan's level was, and that was the scariest part. If Jun Linyuan could defeat someone of Long Yinny's generation, did that mean that he was as powerful as the elders? By elders, Long Yinny was referring to someone of his father's generation. Long Yinny was amazed by how talented Jun Linyuan was. However, as the master of Dragon Valley, he would never admit defeat. Even if he had to lose, he would make sure that he fought to the last moment. He was about to strike again, when Feng Wu suddenly said, "Are you still going to lie there and do nothing?" "What? Who was she talking to?" The crowd was baffled when they saw that she was talking to Mrs. Gu, who was supposed to be dead. Feng Wu sounded like she was talking to a living person. "Are you going to let Dragon Valley be destroyed from seeking revenge on the wrong person?" Her tone gave the others the creeps. Was she talking to a ghost now? "Gu Guanjuan, you bastard!" There was a scream. Meanwhile, Mrs. Gu, who had been lying there with a handkerchief on her face, suddenly sat up. "Holy crap! OMG! Damn! A ghost!" Nearly everyone stumbled back involuntarily, and some people almost fell off the stairs. It was so scary. Mrs. Gu ripped off the white cloth, revealing her pale but furious face. She scrambled to her feet, ran up to Gu Guanjuan, and slapped him. Smack! Lord Gu turned ghastly pale. The crowd was astonished. "Is she a ghost now? Look, there's her shadow on the floor. I heard that ghosts don't have shadows." "That is to say, Mrs. Gu came back to life? Or was she alive this whole time? But why is she hitting Lord Gu?" "Good question." Feng Wu clapped. "Didn't Lord Gu call me a killer? Why is the victim coming after him now?" Gu Guanjuan stiffened when he heard the question. Everyone looked at Lord Gu. Although they didn't say anything, they already had doubts. Mrs. Gu shook from head to toe in rage. She looked like she was about to burn down the entire manor. Ever since she woke up, Gu Guanjuan was all she could see. The others had all fallen into the background. Gu Guanjuan finally realized what was going on. His pupils contracted, and he was ready to kill her. He knew that he couldn't let Mrs. Gu say another word. However, the Crown Prince turned his cold gaze on him, and after a brief moment, Gu Guanjuan could neither move nor speak. He could only watch as Mrs. Gu shouted at him. Chapter 2376, Untitled. Chapter 2376, Untitled. Just then Mrs. Gu shouted at Gu Guanjuan. "Gu Guanjuan, you bastard! If this hadn't happened, I would never have known that you wanted to kill me. My husband tried to kill me." Rumble. Those words were like a thunderclap in everyone's ears. What? Gosh! OMG! Apart from old Mrs. Gu and Lady Gu, who knew the truth, the others all paled when they heard this. Gu Guanjuan was the real killer. How was that even possible? Gu Guanjuan's face had gone ghastly pale, and his mind was blank. She had exposed him. What should he do now? But he didn't lose his composure. In an instant, he regained his poise and spoke in a slightly agitated voice. "My lady, you're awake. Is your head injured? I shouldn't have argued with you. It's all my fault." He tried to take Mrs. Gu's hand, but she smacked his hand away. However, he grabbed her hands and wrapped his arm around her waist. Mrs. Gu couldn't break free from his grip. Feng Wu smiled at her. "Lord Gu, are you trying to cover up your crime by saying that the two of you had an argument and that she injured her head?" Feng Wu then glanced at Long Yinny. "Master Long, aren't you looking for the killer? I think Mrs. Gu has the answer." Long Yinny grabbed Lord Gu's hand. Lord Gu sensed a streak of energy coming from the tips of Long Yinny's fingers. He didn't want to let go of Mrs. Gu, so he stared at Long Yinny and tightened his grip. He knew that if he let go of his wife, she would tell the whole truth. But the fact that he wouldn't let go of Mrs. Gu convinced Long Yinny that he was the killer. "Let go!" Lord Gu immediately attacked Lord Gu. Taken by surprise, Lord Gu stumbled back. "Brother!" Seeing Long Yinny, Mrs. Gu finally felt that she was safe. She burst into tears and shouted, "Brother! He wanted to kill me!" That was the second time she said that. "Sweetheart, what happened?" Old Mrs. Long wrapped her arms around Mrs. Gu and said, Didn't Feng Wu attack you here? Mrs. Gu shook her head. No. That's not what happened. He attacked me in Moon Pavilion, not here. Wow. All eyes were on her. Moon Pavilion. So, that was the crime scene, was it? Feng Wu asked Mrs. Gu. Mrs. Gu said, it all happened in Moon Pavilion. Mrs. Gu pointed at Lord Gu. He pushed me, and I hit my head on the corner of the table. I wanted to get away from him, but he grabbed my hair and stabbed me. He wanted me dead. Mrs. Gu burst into tears. I wanted to know why, and he said. Chapter 2377 Untitled. Chapter 2377 Untitled. That's bullshit. Lord Gu glared at Mrs. Gu. You don't know what you're talking about. Mrs. Gu smiled sadly. I asked you why you wanted to kill me, and what did you say? You said that you never wanted to marry me, and that Dragon Valley forced you. Gu Guanjuan, do you even have a heart? You fainted outside Dragon Valley, covered in blood. You were running away from those people, and I saved you. All eyes were on Lord Gu, whose face was very dark. He looked like he wanted to cut Mrs. Gu into tiny pieces. Mrs. Gu said, You courted me after I saved you, saying that I was the only woman you wanted to marry. I only learned much later that your family messed with the wrong people, and they were trying to kill you. Dragon Valley got you out of trouble in the end, otherwise, the entire Gu family would have been wiped out by now. Dragon Valley is the only reason you've been able to live peacefully for so many years. I only knew how much debt your family was in after I married you, and I've been supporting your family with my dowry ever since. Nearly all of it is gone. What? The Long family glared at Gu Guanjuan. Mrs. Gu went on, I treated your parents like my own ever since I married you. I gave you many children, and I doted on your sister. Have I ever done anything wrong? You live under Dragon Valley's protection and have used Dragon Valley's money, but in the end you tried to kill me. Such accusations. It made people want to cry. Lord Gu wanted to retort but didn't know what to say. Seeing this, Lady Gu was anxious. She had to do something. Sister-in-law, you're awake. I was so worried. Lady Gu wanted to find an opportunity to knock Mrs. Gu out when Mrs. Gu grabbed her arm. The lady said, Gu Yunyan, have I ever done anything to you? Lady Gu said, No, of course not. Mrs. Gu said, If that's the case, why did you help your brother to kill me? What? Lady Gu was in it too? Everyone stared at Lady Gu. Lady Gu said, I. Mrs. Gu stepped forward and said, Do you still remember what you told Gu Guanjuan in that room when you thought that I was dead? Lady Gu already had a guilty conscience. Hearing those words, she stumbled back and fell to the floor. Her face was ghastly pale, and her fingers trembled. What did you say? Brother, don't worry. I tricked Lady Ling into signing that contract, like you said. Lady Ling is so stupid. She can't even read. She thought it was an apology letter. Shut up. Lady Gu panicked. The others were dumbfounded when they heard those words. What? Lady Ling had been tricked into signing the contract? Chapter 2378 Untitled. Chapter 2378 Untitled. Of course, Feng Wu wouldn't let Lady Gu get in the way. She took off Lady Gu's shoes and stuffed them into her mouth, and hit a few of her vital points. That way, Lady Gu couldn't move a muscle. Mrs. Gu glared at Lady Gu and went on exposing her. And what did you say? Feng Wu won't be a problem. So what if she tries to speak up for her mother? We have the marriage contract, and Lady Ling can't change that. If all else fails, we can wait until Feng Wu starts year 4. She'll have to live on campus, and we can bring Lady Ling back home. You also said, My sister-in-law is a beauty, but she has the mind of a 7-year-old. She'll believe everything we tell her. Once you have her, She'll have to accept the reality. What can Feng Wu do? Mrs. Gu pointed at Lady Gu and shouted, "What did you tell me before that? You said that Lady Ling seduced my husband and wouldn't let him go. The truth is, she won't even look at Gu Guanjuan." Shut up. Lord Gu wanted to stop his wife, but he couldn't even lift a finger. He struggled violently, but the restraints around him felt like iron, and he couldn't move a finger. Who did it? Who was restraining him? Lord Gu raised his eyes and met a pair of brooding eyes. His heart sank. The Crown Prince. It was the Crown Prince. Lady Gu wasn't as calm as Lord Gu was. When Mrs. Gu pointed at her, she scrambled away from her in fear. Everyone looked from Mrs. Gu to Feng Wu. It seemed that they had all been misled. Feng Wu was never the killer. She had been framed. I must have been blind. How could I marry an evil man like you? Mrs. Gu was exhausted after she shouted those words. She then fainted and fell to the floor. Long Yenny and old Mrs. Long picked her up and burst into tears. Why did this happen to their sister and daughter? Old Mrs. Gu's heart sank. She had wanted to pretend to faint, but Mrs. Gu beat her to it. Luckily for her, now that Mrs. Gu was unconscious, she could start talking. She gave Lord Gu a warning glance. Lord Gu wanted to say something, but he couldn't make a sound. Left with no other choice, old Mrs. Gu stepped out and held old Mrs. Long's hands. I think my daughter-in-law must have injured her head because someone drugged her. That's why she came up with such an outrageous story. If you believe her, you'll only fall into the culprit's trap. Old Mrs. Long hesitated. Her daughter had indeed been behaving strangely. Was it possible? Feng Wu smiled and told old Mrs. Long, when I discovered Mrs. Gu, she wasn't breathing anymore. I used some acupuncture needles to revive her. Seeing that old Mrs. Long still didn't look fully convinced, Feng Wu frowned. Mrs. Gu mentioned Moon Pavilion just then. That is to say, Moon Pavilion is the crime scene, right? That's right. Emperor Wu rose to his feet. I think we should take a look. Lord Gu panicked. Moon Pavilion was indeed where the attack had taken place. He had thought that Mrs. Gu was dead, so he hadn't cleaned up the place. The others would easily find out what happened there. Chapter 2379 Untitled. Chapter 2379 Untitled. Lord Gu kept giving his steward warning glances. The steward, who was standing behind the crowd, took the hint and promptly left. Emperor Wu frowned a little and glanced at Qin Yan. He trusted the man. The Qin family had two sons, Qin Mo and Qin Yan. Qin Mo was the head of military intelligence and worked in the shadows. Qin Yan was Emperor Wu's personal guard and the most senior of the imperial guards. He nodded at Emperor Wu and quickly left. Hardly anyone noticed that Qin Yan was gone, so Lord Gu thought that he might still have a chance. When he arrived at Moon Pavilion, he saw something unexpected. Qin Yan was holding Steward Gu down with his foot, and oil was splashed everywhere around them. He stepped hard, and Steward Gu screeched in pain. Seeing this, Lord Gu was filled with despair. What's going on? Emperor Wu frowned. Qin Yan said, Your Majesty, I came here to examine Moon Pavilion, but this sneaky old man was pouring oil all over the building. He wanted to burn the place down. How dare he? Emperor Wu was furious. He turned around and stared at Gu Guanjuan. Are you trying to fool me? Gu Guanjuan's face had lost all color, and he shook from head to toe. Emperor Wu told Qin Yan, check the room. Qin Yan said, Yes, Your Majesty. Qin Yan led some men into Moon Pavilion and soon came back to report to Emperor Wu. Your Majesty, a table inside has been knocked over. The blood splatter fits Mrs. Gu's recount. Moon Pavilion is indeed the crime scene. Those words signed Lord Gu's death warrant. All eyes were on him. His children stared at him in disbelief. Why is this happening? I can't believe it. What's going on? What's happening to our family? I don't believe you. None of them could accept what had happened. It was horrible. The looks the others gave them were even more complicated. At first, everyone believed that Feng Wu was the killer, but it turned out that she had been wronged, and Lord Gu was the real culprit. Lord Gu looked at each child in turn before glaring at Feng Wu. Suddenly, he smiled bitterly. He laughed like a mad person. I never thought that I would be defeated by a girl. He looked from Jun Linshan to the ladies, before turning his gaze on Feng Wu. You won. After that, his hand shifted in his sleeve. Poof! Jun Linyuan knocked the dagger out of his hand. He wouldn't let Lord Gu die so easily. Then something unexpected happened. My lady! Mrs. Zhou shouted. Everyone was shocked when they saw a dagger in the old lady's chest, and she herself was holding the handle. That was to say. Chapter 2380 Untitled. Chapter 2380 Untitled. Old Mrs. Gu had committed suicide. Gosh! Everyone sucked in their breath. Old Mrs. Gu pushed away from the people who tried to help her. She looked at Emperor Wu and knelt down. Both old Mrs. Long and Long Yenny frowned. Blood was oozing out of old Mrs. Gu's mouth. She suddenly turned to Feng Wu and said, I'll take full responsibility for everything that happened. Please forgive the Gu family. She dropped to the ground and died. Grandma! The Gu brothers cried out. Feng Wu's face darkened. What a sinister woman. She still tried to get back at Feng Wu even after her death. Feng Wu had already cleared her and her mother's reputations. The grudge was between the Gu and Long families now. However, with what the old lady had done, all the members of the Gu family would always see Feng Wu as the person who had humiliated their family and killed their grandmother. Feng Wu! Feng Wu smirked. The Gu family was trying to make the Feng family their target because they couldn't handle the Long family. How naive. Feng Wu! I'm gonna kill you! 4 of the 6 brothers charged at Feng Wu together. Mrs. Zhou shook her head. Those stupid boys had no idea what Feng Wu's level was. She reminded them, I think you should take care of your grandmother's funeral first. They shouldn't just leave the dead body on the ground. Gu Xingqing snorted. Are you on Feng Wu's side as well? Mrs. Zhou was speechless. Where did that come from? She wanted Feng Wu dead more than anything in this world. All 4 of them had been defeated by Feng Wu before, but they felt that if they fought her together, they could surely turn things around. Feng Wu smirked. These men didn't intimidate her. She took out her fire dragon rod. Bring it on. She had been waiting for a fight. Many people were concerned. Isn't Feng Wu a level 7 spiritual elder? She'll be killed. The Gu brothers are all very talented. No, she's not. She's at least a level 3 spiritual lord. Then it's going to be a fierce battle. Emperor Wu was speechless. Xiao Wu was a level 7 spiritual lord. Those boys would never be her match. Thump, thump, thump. Feng Wu knocked the boys on their heads. Emperor Wu was right. Those boys weren't her match at all. Thump. Before the 4 teenagers could react, they were already rolling around on the ground and howling in pain. Many people were shocked. Feng Wu was incredible. Feng Wu then slammed the rod down on the ground and snorted. Anyone else? The crowd was speechless. Chapter 2381 Untitled. Chapter 2381 Untitled. Mrs. Zhou wanted to leave. She didn't want to see Feng Wu showing off her talent. Finally, the others knew how capable Feng Wu was. Shit! She's so talented! If I remember correctly, Gu Xingyuan is the most talented of the 4. He's at least a level 3 spiritual lord. Feng Wu defeated all of them on her own. Feng Wu is at least a level 4 spiritual lord, isn't she? Maybe she's a little bit more advanced than that. Are you saying that she's a level 5 spiritual lord? OMG. How old is she? She's barely 14. Gosh. She really is a genius. Compared to her, the Gu brothers are nothing. So what? That doesn't change the fact that she's both arrogant and mean. Everyone was talking at the same time. Emperor Wu almost rolled his eyes. A level 4 spiritual lord. Are they blind? Xiao Wu is a level 7 spiritual lord. Even Emperor Wu didn't notice that he felt like a proud father when other people praised Feng Wu. I'll fight her. With a cold voice, a teenager dressed in white landed in front of Feng Wu. He frowned and looked at her in disdain. Brother Xingyi! The Gu brothers cried out in excitement when they saw their second brother. She hit us. She killed Grandma. She humiliated us. You have to avenge us. All four boys looked at Gu Xingyi in expectation. That's Gu Xingyi, someone cried out. So what? Do you not know who that is? He's a Year 4 student at Imperial College. When he was in Year 3, he formed a 5-man team and fought the team from Martial Art College. It was a brilliant battle, and he's been famous ever since. All 5 men skipped Year 3 and entered Year 4 after that, right? I heard that they're all good friends. That's right. And the most talented of the 5 is... Gu Xingyi was a level 4 spiritual lord back then. I wonder. He's a level 6 spiritual lord now, said someone. Gosh. What will Feng Wu do? Emperor Wu wanted to yawn. So what if he's a level 6 spiritual lord? Xiao Wu is already a level 7 spiritual lord. How boring, thought Emperor Wu. However, only a handful of people knew Feng Wu's true capability. Most people thought that she wasn't Gu Xingyi's match. Even Gu Xingyi himself thought so. He narrowed his eyes before turning to Emperor Wu. He bowed and said, Your Majesty, will you be my witness? Emperor Wu asked, Of what? Chapter 2382, Untitled. Chapter 2382, Untitled. Gu Xingyi gritted his teeth and said, Feng Wu humiliated my family, so I'm challenging her to a duel. It'll be a fight to the death. Your Majesty, will you be my witness? Wow. The crowd grew excited. A fight to the death. It had been a while since they had one of those. Mrs. Zhou found Gu Xingyi's request idiotic. Feng Wu is a level 7 spiritual lord, and you're only level 6. You're doomed. She tried to warn him. Gu Xingyi, maybe you don't have to. Thank you, Mrs. Zhou, but if you try to stop me, I'll think that you're on Feng Wu's side, said Gu Xingyi coldly. Mrs. Zhou was shocked. What a fool. She decided to let him be. If he was killed, Feng Wu would be responsible for 2 deaths in the Gu family, which would be good news for the Zhou family. After that, no one else tried to stop Gu Xingyi. Emperor Wu frowned at him. Do you really want to die? Gu Xingyi asked, Your Majesty, do you have no faith in me at all? Emperor Wu thought, that's right. Seeing that Gu Xingyi was displeased, Emperor Wu said, Fine. You can have the fight if Feng Wu agrees to it. Gu Xingyi finally turned his gaze on Feng Wu. I'm challenging you to a fight to the death. Will you accept my challenge? All eyes were on Feng Wu. She could say no. After all, he had already earned his fame, and few people had confidence in her. She could turn him down. Feng Wu said coldly, You should cherish your life. Gu Xingyi said, I don't cherish yours. Feng Wu shrugged. So. Everyone thought that Feng Wu would be forced to accept the challenge, but they were all wrong. She smiled and said, I don't accept your challenge. Gu Xingyi glared at her. Why? Feng Wu said, It's a waste of time. Gu Xingyi said, You. Just then, someone cried out in the crowd. Assassins! Protect His Majesty! Emperor Wu looked at Qin Yan. Qin Yan followed the sound and saw a team of people coming toward them. The team was led by Feng Sun. Feng Sun. Emperor Wu was perplexed. Your Majesty, there are some assassins. Feng Sun whispered in Emperor Wu's ear. Are you sure? Emperor Wu's eyes lit up. He then told Qin Yan, go with Feng Sun. Catch the assassins. Qin Yan nodded and left with Feng Sun. Emperor Wu then turned to the crowd and looked at each person in turn. The temperature seemed to drop and the air grew chilly. What was going on? Everyone was perplexed, especially the members of the Gu family. They realized that the emperor was looking at them in rage. Rage. What did Feng Sun tell the emperor? Chapter 2383 Untitled. Chapter 2383 Untitled. There was no warmth in Emperor Wu's eyes. After a short while, they could hear the sound of fighting in the distance. Gu Xingyuan went pale when he heard the noise. Gu Xingyuan, why are you shaking? Emperor Wu asked in an unperturbed tone. But his voice only made Gu Xingyuan more anxious. I'm not shaking. Gu Xingyuan took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. That's a very brave thing to say for someone who's abetting a foreign spy, Emperor Wu said casually. What? If old Mrs. Gu had been alive, she would have jumped to her feet. Abetting an enemy spy. That was a serious accusation. It was a crime punishable by death and could incriminate one's entire clan. Gu Xingyuan felt that his heart was going to jump out of his throat. He forced himself to calm down as he knelt in front of Emperor Wu. Your Majesty, I never did such a thing. There's no spy of the Dongsheng Kingdom in my household. Someone must be framing me. The other members of the Gu family all gave him strange looks, but Gu Xingyuan didn't realize what he had said. How do you know that I'm talking about a spy of the Dongsheng Kingdom? Why can't they be from somewhere else? Emperor Wu asked indifferently. Gu Xingyuan almost blurted out the truth, but he reacted quickly and said, Your Majesty has been searching the whole city for Dongsheng spies, and I still remember it. That's why I automatically assumed it was a Dongsheng spy. That could explain his reply. It was just that. So, how did you learn that I'm searching for Dongsheng spies? Gu Xingyuan was so frightened that his voice trembled. I. Emperor Wu smacked the table. You knew I was looking for them, but you still hid one. That's unforgivable. Gu Xingyuan paled. Your Majesty, I'm not. Qin Yan and Feng Sun came back at that moment. They brought someone with them. Qin Yan threw the person, who was tied up, on the ground and said, She tried to fight back, and when we caught her, she tried to kill herself. Emperor Wu stared at the woman on the ground. She was just over 20 and had the most alluring eyes. The outer corners of her eyes slanted upward slightly, giving her the look of a fox. Is she a Dongsheng Kingdom spy? Emperor Wu asked with a frown. Your Majesty, please don't tease me. I'm a native of the Junwu Empire. How can I be from the Dongsheng Kingdom, let alone their spy? The woman giggled. Gu Xingyuan said, Your Majesty, this is Miss Qingyang, a dancer at Spring Aroma. She's no spy. Many other people chimed in. That's right. Miss Qingyang is a dancer at Spring Aroma. I've met her before. She grew up there, and that's a fact. How can she be a spy of the Dongsheng Kingdom? They all tried to defend her because they had all visited Spring Aroma. If Qingyang was proven to be a spy of the Dongsheng Kingdom, they might all become suspects. Emperor Wu looked at Feng Sun. Chapter 2384 Untitled. Chapter 2384 Untitled. Emperor Wu looked at Feng Sun in bewilderment. He had seen the list of the names of Dongsheng spies, but Qingyang wasn't on it. Feng Sun glanced at Feng Wu. Feng Wu nodded. With Feng Wu's reassurance, Feng Sun was full of confidence. If she said yes, it had to be true. Qingyang smiled at Feng Sun and said, Young Lord Feng, I'm only here because young Master Gu Xingyuan invited me here to dance for the old lady for her birthday. How did I become a spy? Young Lord Feng, if you can accuse me of being a spy, will you do the same to other people? Feng Sun frowned. Your Majesty. The Gu family reacted quickly. Lord Gu was going to use this opportunity. He might be able to get away with the attempted murder, but espionage was too serious an accusation for the Gu family to bear. He immediately said, Your Majesty, young Lord Feng must have made this up because he's trying to avenge Feng Wu. Emperor Wu glanced at Feng Wu. If she couldn't prove that Qingyang was. But at that moment, a shadow moved toward Qingyang. It was aimed at her throat. At that critical moment, Qingyang shifted, but she soon realized what she was doing. Shit. She was supposed to be the most popular escort of Spring Aroma and shouldn't have any cultivation skills, but just then, she activated them a little. Qingyang immediately stood still and hoped that no one had noticed. But what she didn't know was, a small magic vine rose out of Feng Wu's palm, which she hid in her sleeve. The vine only had 2 leaves on it, but it was enough for Feng Wu to tell that Qingyang was from the Dongsang Kingdom. Magic Soul Vine had become quite handy. Who would have thought that what Feng Wu experienced in the tomb would be a blessing in disguise? She walked up to Qingyang and smiled. You want some proof, don't you? Qingyang smirked. You can't accuse me of being a Dongsang spy when you have no evidence at all. Stop fighting it, said Feng Wu. Qingyang was perplexed. What did Feng Wu mean? But before she could react, Feng Wu raised her hand, and Little Phoenix charged at Qingyang. Qingyang smirked. She wouldn't be fooled this time. She decided that she would keep very still this time. She didn't think that Feng Wu would kill her in front of everyone without a shred of evidence. The others also gave Feng Wu doubtful looks. How was she going to prove that Qingyang was a Dongsang spy? The Gu family decided that if Feng Wu couldn't prove it, they would make sure that Feng Wu was ruined forever. Lord Gu stared at Feng Wu with eyes filled with hatred. No matter what happened after this was over, Feng Wu would become his lifelong enemy. He would do everything to destroy Feng Wu and her loved ones. However, no one saw what came next. Not even Qingyang. Feng Wu drew out a dagger and stabbed it into Qingyang's chest. Qingyang didn't even try to dodge. Thump. Chapter 2385, Untitled. Chapter 2385, Untitled. There was the sound of metal cutting into flesh. The entire blade was buried in Qingyang's chest. Everyone was astonished. What was that? What did they just see? Qingyang was the most shocked of them all. She never expected that Feng Wu would try to kill someone in front of the emperor. Qingyang stared at Feng Wu in disbelief. She then looked down at her chest and saw that her clothes were soaked with her blood. Feng Wu! How dare you! Gu Xingyuan shouted. He was in love with Qingyang, and it had taken him some great effort to invite her here. However, she was going to be killed here. I'm going to kill you! Gu Xingyuan's eyes were bloodshot red. The others all stared at Feng Wu in disbelief. Mrs. Zhou cried out, Feng Wu, how could you do that? You're killing an innocent person. Feng Wu ignored her. She kept her gaze on the pretty girl and smiled. Do you know why I'm going to kill you? Qingyang gritted her teeth and wouldn't say a word. Because I can only find your accomplice after I kill you. Feng Wu smiled at her. What did she mean? Everyone else was confused. But Qingyang knew what she meant. She glared at Feng Wu. Gu Xingyuan opened his mouth again, but Emperor Wu gave Qin Yan a warning glance. Qin Yan stepped out and kicked Gu Xingyuan, knocking him out. No one else dared to utter a word after that. It was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Feng Wu told Qingyang, You're looking to the southeast now, aren't you? Do you think looking away will save your friend? The moment I stabbed you, I saw that person clench his fists and stumble back. However, he stepped forward again so that no one would notice. Stumble back. Everyone stared at Feng Wu. When they saw Qingyang being stabbed, they were so astonished that they froze on the spot. Only a person with a guilty conscience would stumble back. And only an angry man would clench his fist. It was very clever for Feng Wu to reach that conclusion. Wait. If Feng Wu was right, that meant that Qingyang really was a Dongseng spy. Many people turned pale. Qingyang clenched her teeth and glared at Feng Wu. She suddenly giggled. Miss Feng Wu, are you bluffing? Unfortunately, I'm not a Dongseng. It's him, isn't it? Feng Wu pointed at a man while keeping her gaze on Qingyang. When Qingyang saw who Feng Wu was pointing at, her pupils contracted, and her lips trembled. Your reaction has exposed him. Thank you, Miss Qingyang. Feng Wu chuckled. Everyone was shocked when they saw who Feng Wu was pointing at. How could it be him? Something happened at that moment. Watch out! Xiao Wu! Qingyang suddenly moved. She wrapped her arms around Feng Wu and gathered her energy together. It's the explosion skill of the Dongseng Kingdom. Run! Chapter 2386, Untitled. Chapter 2386, Untitled. Turning oneself into a human bomb was a specialty of the Dongseng Kingdom, and all its people loved to use it when they were defeated. The people of the Dongseng Kingdom had a special skill. When they chose to explode, their cultivation level would rise significantly. For instance, when a junior spiritual king exploded, they would exert the power of a level 5 or 6 spiritual king. Everyone paled when they saw what Qingyang was going to do. Qingyang's energy began to surge like a volcano that was about to erupt. Once she exploded, the power would even be able to burn houses to the ground. No human body could withstand such power. Everyone turned pale and stumbled back. They were sure that they were going to die. No one had thought that a mere dancer would have such an ability. There was no doubt that she was a Dongseng spy. Feng Wu was the most unfortunate one, because Qingyang had wrapped her arms around Feng Wu when she decided to turn herself into a bomb. Xiao Wu. Feng Sun's face went ghastly pale. If they didn't do something, there would be nothing left of Xiao Wu. Feng Sun turned to look at Jun Linyuan. But Boss Jun was no longer there. He had been sitting in the chair a moment ago. Where was he now? Rumble. Qingyang exploded. Shit! His Royal Highness! His Royal Highness is up there! When the explosion started, everyone lay on their stomachs and covered their heads, but they couldn't help looking up. Jun Linyuan had jumped into the air so fast that no one saw how he got there. He pulled Feng Wu into his arms and kicked Qingyang away. Boom! Qingyang exploded in midair. She turned into a ball of fire before falling into the lake behind the manor. Rumble! The water erupted as high as over 10 meters. When it fell back down, it smashed a pavilion to pieces. All the plants within the area were destroyed as well. It was such a terrifying scene. Everyone looked shaken. Gu Xingyuan woke up at that moment. He looked at the silent crowd and saw that his girl wasn't around. He immediately ran up to Feng Wu, who had just landed, and shouted, "Where is Miss Qingyang? Where did you take her? Give her back." Everyone found that an idiotic thing to say. "Your Majesty, Feng Wu is abusing her power and bullying people weaker than her. She should be arrested. Your Majesty, please punish her." Gu Xingyuan screamed. He then realized that something was wrong. It was too quiet. And the looks the others gave him were so strange. Somehow, he felt uneasy. Everyone looked from Gu Xingyuan to Feng Wu. Jun Linyuan was still holding Feng Wu after they landed, but there was no expression on his face, and the temperature around him was dropping. Feng Wu licked her lips, feeling a little guilty. She realized that Jun Linyuan was very angry. She tugged at his sleeve. Chapter 2387, Your Royal Highness, Don't Be Mad. Chapter 2387, Your Royal Highness, Don't Be Mad. Feng Wu said, I took the risk because I knew you would save me. She looked up at the teenager. When his face darkened, it gave him an even more majestic look. Stop it, Feng Wu thought. Why should I care if he's attractive? I just don't want him to tell me off in front of everyone. That would be so humiliating. However, the Crown Prince was glaring at her. He was angry. Many people were pleasantly surprised. They knew how terrifying the Crown Prince could be when he was angry. He had once destroyed his entire residence when he lost his temper. They thought that he was going to kill Feng Wu. Mrs. Dugu, Mrs. Zhua, and the people of the Gu family were so excited that they almost yelled. Emperor Wu cleared his throat and thought about stopping Jun Linyuan. However, he hesitated because he would be quite embarrassed if Jun Linyuan ignored him. So he waited. The crowd grew excited. The Crown Prince was still staring at Feng Wu and looked like he wanted to slap her. Right now, no one cared about the second Dongseng spy that Feng Wu had discovered. All eyes were on Jun Linyuan and Feng Wu. Feng Wu was genuinely scared every time Jun Linyuan was furious, so she always tried to appease him. This time was no exception. Seeing Jun Linyuan's dark face, she knew that if she didn't apologize now, there would be consequences. So, she tried to take Jun Linyuan's hand. However, as soon as her fingertips touched his fingers, thump! He brushed off her hand. The crowd's eyes lit up. Nice. They began to whisper among themselves. I thought the rumor was that His Royal Highness liked Feng Wu and doted on her. That's not true. If that was the case, His Royal Highness wouldn't have brushed off her hand. I bet her hand is swollen now. That's right. His Royal Highness has never liked Feng Wu. I heard that His Royal Highness likes to kill people when he's angry. Will he kill Feng Wu? That would be so terrifying. Many influential families had been invited here today, and most of them had unmarried daughters. Naturally, they all considered Feng Wu their enemy. Most of the people here wanted to see Feng Wu punished. That was especially the case with the Gu family. Feng Wu sighed inwardly when Jun Linyuan threw off her hand. She could walk away now, but the truth was that she had only taken the risk because she knew that Jun Linyuan would save her. She had to show him her gratitude. Moreover, she could tell that Jun Linyuan regretted it after he threw off her hand. At that thought, Feng Wu tugged at his sleeve again with the most innocent look in her eyes. Chapter 2388, Untitled. Chapter 2388, Untitled. Everyone looked at Feng Wu in disbelief. How can Miss Feng Wu still? Why is she still holding His Royal Highness's arm? Isn't she afraid that he'll throw off her hand? That's so humiliating. Everyone felt so embarrassed for Feng Wu. The Crown Prince stared at Feng Wu and looked very displeased. Feng Wu lowered her head and swayed his wide sleeve back and forth. From Jun Linyuan's angle, he could only see her lowered head. The Crown Prince glowered. If you want to die, just say so. Don't waste my time. Feng Wu lowered her head and bit her lower lip. The crowd grew excited, believing that the Crown Prince was going to kill Feng Wu. Feng Wu looked up and looked at Jun Linyuan like an abandoned puppy. That look dissipated most of Jun Linyuan's anger. He glared at the girl. What are you going to tell me now? Feng Wu lowered her head and said, I. Jun Linyuan said, I can't hear you. Feng Wu whimpered, I'm sorry. Jun Linyuan asked, What are you sorry for? Feng Wu said, I shouldn't have gotten myself in danger. Jun Linyuan grumbled, Are you going to do it again? Feng Wu looked up. When she saw his cold face, she immediately looked down and said, No, of course not. She kicked around some pebbles and mumbled, I only did it because you were there." Hearing that, the Crown Prince couldn't bring himself to be mad at her anymore. The girl then looked up and smiled at him. It was a very bright smile, but it was obsequious at the same time. The teenager's face lit up. He gave Feng Wu such an affectionate look. The crowd was baffled. What? Wasn't he supposed to push Feng Wu away and humiliate her? Instead of the scene they had expected, they had to watch how much the Crown Prince fancied Feng Wu. It took everyone by surprise. All the Gu brothers were astonished. The others all looked like they had been struck by lightning. Mrs. Dugu grabbed Mrs. Zhua and whispered, "Tell Qingluan to come back now. Otherwise they would lose everything." The truth was Mrs. Zhua was flustered as well. The way the Crown Prince looked at Feng Wu made Mrs. Zhua very uneasy. But she couldn't let Mrs. Dugu see it. "How does Qingluan have anything to do with it?" Mrs. Zhua feigned a calm tone. Mrs. Dugu gave Mrs. Zhua a long look. She knew that Mrs. Zhua could see it as well. She only said, "If Qingluan doesn't come back now, that girl will take His Royal Highness from her. You'll regret it for the rest of your life." Chapter 2389 Untitled. Chapter 2389 Untitled. Mrs. Zhua smirked. "That girl is nothing compared with Qingluan." Mrs. Dugu shook her head inwardly. If Mrs. Dugu could see it, so could everyone else. The Crown Prince was obviously in love with the girl. Lord Gu couldn't feel any more frustrated. He stared at Lady Gu and wanted to tear her to pieces. If she had told him Feng Wu's relationship with the Crown Prince, he would never have made such a huge mistake. Jun Linshan was almost in tears. He had really thought that Feng Wu was only Jun Linyuan's maid, but he realized now that he couldn't be more wrong. She was obviously Jun Linyuan's favorite woman. Of course, many people were still trying to convince themselves that the Crown Prince didn't mean that. Ahem. Emperor Wu cleared his throat at that moment and asked, "Xiao Wu, are we still looking for that spy?" Feng Wu had no idea how her interaction with Jun Linyuan had shocked the others. She was used to talking to Jun Linyuan that way. She was perplexed when she saw the look in everyone else's eyes. She came back to her senses when she heard Emperor Wu. That was right. She still hadn't finished the 10th trial yet. There had been 3 names left on the list a moment before, but now there were only 2. Qingyang really had been a spy from the Dongsang Kingdom. And another one was. Feng Wu turned around and looked at old Steward Gu. Meanwhile, Qin Yan was holding down the old man. Seeing that Feng Wu was looking his way, Qin Yan explained, "When the explosion happened, he tried to run." Qin Yan was a very advanced cultivator and had never lost a battle. Apart from Emperor Wu, he almost never spoke to anyone. It was very rare for him to speak to Feng Wu. Qin Yan was holding down old Steward Gu with one foot. Feng Wu walked up to the old man, crouched down, and smiled at him. Seeing this, the Crown Prince pulled her back a little. Feng Wu didn't know what to say. She said softly, "Don't worry. You're here. What can possibly happen?" The Crown Prince rolled his eyes at her. He was worried about her. Feng Wu turned back to the steward. "Why did you run? You've exposed yourself." Lord Gu said, "Your Majesty, Steward Gu is a servant who was born into this family. He definitely isn't a spy." Feng Wu looked over her shoulder and said, "Lord Gu, you talk too much. It'll affect my deductions." Emperor Wu looked at his guards. The guards immediately grabbed Lord Gu's arms, forced him to kneel and stuffed 2 walnuts into his mouth. Lord Gu could neither speak nor move. "I have no idea what Miss Feng is talking about." Steward Gu denied all accusations. Feng Wu smiled. Of course he was a Dongsang spy. The magical vine in her palm was moving so violently. Chapter 2390 Untitled. Chapter 2390, Untitled. Feng Wu chuckled. Do you know how I spotted Qingyang and your friend? She moved closer and whispered something in his ear. The old man's pupils contracted, and he glared at Feng Wu. Feng Wu had just told him that she could read minds. Whenever she was close enough to a person, she could hear what they were thinking. No. I don't believe you. The old man activated his energy and tried to block Feng Wu. Are you telling yourself not to think about that last friend's whereabouts? Feng Wu smiled at him. I already read your mind. You're so worried about that person. Steward Gu closed his eyes. He wouldn't let Feng Wu see any emotions on his face. Feng Wu waved her hand, and a tiny tiger jumped out of her sleeve. The cub was slightly bigger than before, but it still looked like a ball of white fur. Feng Wu patted its head and said, This old man has a special smell of blood on him. Take a sniff and find the person he has hidden away. Steward Gu smirked. The smell of blood? The person he had hidden away was indeed injured. But he had washed off the blood on his sleeve. No one could smell it. To his surprise, the cub kept sniffing at his sleeve and wouldn't leave. The old man's stomach lurched. He opened his eyes and saw that it was focusing on the spot where his sleeve had been stained with the blood. To fend off Feng Wu's mental power, he had stiffened. He almost lost control when he saw the cub. Feng Wu patted the cub and said, Go! The cub dashed off and was soon out of sight. Feng Wu kept her gaze on Steward Gu the entire time. The old man was obviously relieved when he saw the cub run away. His stomach lurched when he saw Feng Wu's gaze. Feng Wu smiled mysteriously, and it only made Steward Gu more nervous. He recalled that Feng Wu was able to force Qingyang to take action because Qingyang hadn't been calm enough. Right now, Feng Wu was studying his face. He snorted. You can try all you want, but you won't read my mind. His eyes then darted around. He looked everywhere, trying to confuse Feng Wu. The crowd couldn't help but look at Feng Wu. So, everything she said was a bluff. She's actually observing Steward Gu's facial expressions. Unfortunately, she can only use that trick once. Steward Gu isn't stupid. He won't fall for the same trick twice. Miss Feng Wu thinks too highly of herself. The truth was, Emperor Wu thought the same as well. Therefore, he wanted to know how Feng Wu was going to find the third person. The cub came back with a wooden box in its mouth. It was covered with mud. Needless to say, the cub had just dug it out. Chapter 2391, Untitled. Chapter 2391, Untitled. Someone laughed. What a silly cub. It was supposed to look for a person, and what did it find? That wooden box is so small it can barely fit a person's ashes, let alone a person. Why do I feel that Miss Feng Wu is bluffing? No one had much hope in Feng Wu. They didn't believe that she could find all three spies in a row. Moreover, if all three were to be found here, the Gu family would be so unlucky. However, Steward Gu's eyes popped when he saw the wooden box. He glared at Feng Wu, and his eyes were bloodshot red. Feng Wu patted him on the shoulder. You spend a lot of time blocking my mind. Even if you turn into a human bomb now, it won't be very effective. Just give up. Steward Gu glared at Feng Wu and wanted to swallow her whole. She had done it on purpose. The cub put down the box and looked proudly at Feng Wu. Feng Wu rubbed its head. Good job. The cub happily rolled around in her arms. Meanwhile, Feng Wu opened the box. Inside was a finely made bronze key. Steward Gu bit his lower lip. What door does it open? Feng Wu asked. You'll never find it. Steward Gu smiled eerily, and blood oozed out of his mouth. He had hidden some poison in his mouth. All eyes were on Feng Wu. Someone said unhappily, that was so careless of her. With Steward Gu dead, we'll never find the last spy. Feng Wu ignored the complaint. She just grinned at the old man. Do you think your death can stop me from finding that door? Let me remind you, while you were glancing around, you kept avoiding a single spot. Steward Gu wasn't dead yet, so he heard those words. He looked horrified. That is the place you were avoiding looking at, right? Feng Wu threw the wooden box at the rockery nearby. The rockery slid open to reveal a red door behind it. The Gu brothers all looked at Lord Gu, surprised that there was such a secret chamber in the manor, but Lord Gu frowned because he didn't know anything about it. Steward Gu couldn't believe his eyes. Feng Wu chuckled. People of Dongsang are so stupid. How can they fall for the same trick twice? Am I right, Captain of the Jupiter team? Steward Gu's pupils contracted. He stared at Feng Wu until he dropped to the ground and died. Feng Wu tossed the key to Feng Sun and let him take care of the rest. Feng Sun opened the door. Sunlight lit up the dim room, and they saw an injured person sitting against the wall. The last spy was found. What happened next was none of Feng Wu's business. She bid Emperor Wu farewell, saying that she needed to go home to her beautiful mother. Chapter 2392, Untitled. Chapter 2392, Untitled. Of course, Emperor Wu wouldn't stop her. Seeing that Feng Wu was gone, the others left as well. On their way home, Qiuling, Chaoga, and Feng Wu were in the same carriage. Xiao Wu, you're amazing. Chaoga grabbed Feng Wu's hand in excitement. I knew they would give us trouble, but I didn't expect it to be on such a scale. Qiuling remained silent, but she kept looking at Feng Wu with admiration in her eyes. No matter what those people threw at Feng Wu, she managed to fight back every single time. She practically destroyed Lord Gu's family all by herself. Miss Wu, what do you think will happen to the Gu family? Qiuling asked curiously. Feng Wu smiled. Lord Gu tried to kill his wife, so the Long family will be after him. However, his biggest problem is those Dongsang spies. His Majesty probably won't execute the entire family, but Lord Gu will definitely lose his title. Will they still be one of the 9 major clans? Duan Chaoga asked. Feng Wu shook her head. I'm not sure. It will depend on if the 9 clans join hands. Qiuling said, I saw that Lady Gu was left behind in the Gu family. Feng Wu nodded. Seeing that the Gu family was going to be in trouble, Lady Gu had immediately wanted to go back to the Feng family. Unfortunately, after what she did to Feng Wu, the Feng family would never take her back. What about Lady Wang? Qiuling asked. I'm sure she was in on it as well. Feng Wu smiled. She'll have a hard time too. Now that all 3 elders were on Feng Wu's side, Lady Wang's days were numbered. Before long, they arrived at the Feng manor. Feng Wu got out and saw that Lady Wang's carriage was hesitating to move closer. It seemed that Lady Wang had genuinely been frightened by what happened today. Feng Wu didn't have time for Lady Wang at the moment, and decided to let her stay scared for a while. Lady Wang's carriage only approached the front gate of the Feng manor after Feng Wu left. Lady Wang opened the curtain of the carriage and let out a breath of relief when she saw that Feng Wu was really gone. Gosh, finally! Feng Sang asked coldly, Mother, are you afraid of her? Lady Wang almost jumped at the sudden voice. She glared at Feng Sang and said, Nonsense. Feng Sang said, Our carriage was in the front at first, but you told the driver to slow down, and you wouldn't move closer to their carriage. Mother, I thought you were going to kill her to avenge Lu, but now… Shut up. Lady Wang glowered at Feng Sang. She wondered why her daughter wasn't afraid. Feng Wu is His Majesty's favorite now. It's not that easy to get our revenge. We need a good plan. Lady Wang rushed into the house after that. Feng Wu went back to Fallen Star Yard. Granny Zhao came out in a hurry. Miss Wu, you're back. Are you all right? Qiuling asked, Granny Zhao, why are you so worried? Granny Zhao said, People have been saying that Miss Wu killed Mrs. Gu. I was worried sick. Chilling chuckled. Chapter 2393 Untitled. Chapter 2393 Untitled. Granny Zhao smacked Chilling on the head. Stop it! How can you still laugh? Chilling chuckled. Miss Wu didn't kill anyone, so there's no need to worry. You have no idea what we saw in the Gu Manor today. It was such an eye-opener. Granny Zhao's eyes lit up. Tell me all about it. Chilling said. You'll never guess who the culprit was. Granny Zhao asked, Who? Chilling told her everything. Both Chilling and Chaoga were good storytellers. Granny Zhao and Uncle Chio's mouths dropped open as they listened. In the end, Chilling smacked the marriage agreement on the table. The Gu Manor will fall, and Lady Gu isn't coming back. No one will dare pick on us again. Meanwhile, similar conversations were taking place in nearly all families in the imperial capital. From the officials to the street vendors. What? Feng Wu didn't attack Mrs. Gu. Lord Gu was the culprit. And the Gu Manor was hiding a spy. What? There were 3 of them? Only the night before, they had been discussing how Feng Wu had killed Mrs. Gu, but things had turned around completely. Not only didn't Miss Feng Wu kill Mrs. Gu, she also helped to catch the spies. Everyone in the imperial capital was talking about it. Somehow, no one mentioned the Crown Prince's interactions with Feng Wu, probably because the people who had seen it chose to omit the fact. As a result, the common people still had no idea how the Crown Prince felt about Feng Wu. But the topic soon changed because Xiao Wu. Chaoga had been listening to other people complimenting Feng Wu in a tea-house, but she jumped to her feet when she heard the news. Look, there are so many magpies. Are they here to congratulate Miss Feng Wu? No, that's not it. Look, that's a phoenix carriage. Magpies and a phoenix carriage. Gosh, it's Miss Zhuo Qingluan. That's right. It must be her. I heard that she was coming back. She has the true phoenix blood and is the most talented girl in our empire. Yes, it's her. The crowd was so excited that they all rushed into the street. Zhuo Qingluan? The smile froze on Chaoga's face. Of course she knew who that was. Back then, Feng Wu and Zhuo Qingluan both had the true phoenix blood, and they were known as the 2 genius girls of the imperial capital. People used to compare them all the time. Chaoga jumped out the window on the 2nd floor and ran back to Fallen Star Yard. Xiao Wu, I have bad news. Chaoga ran into the courtyard. Feng Wu had been cultivating under the grape trellis. Hearing that, she looked at Chaoga in bewilderment. What? Is the sky going to cave in? She asked grumpily. Chaoga said, No, but you're going to have trouble. Feng Wu stood up and straightened her skirt. Why is that? Chaoga dragged her toward the front door. Zhuo Qingluan is back. Feng Wu paused. Chapter 2394 Untitled. Chapter 2394 Untitled. Chaoga almost tripped. She looked gingerly at Feng Wu. Zhuo Qingluan was her archenemy, so was she afraid? She wondered if she had done the wrong thing when she tried to take Feng Wu to see Zhuo Qingluan. Chaoga was feeling uneasy when Feng Wu said, Let's go. But Chaoga didn't want to go anymore, so she said, Xiao Wu, I don't think we should go. Why not? Feng Wu put her hand on Chaoga's shoulder and smiled. I'd like to meet my archenemy as well and see how she's doing. Let's go. The streets were packed. Miss Qingluan is heading toward East Avenue. Everyone, get moving. Miss Qingluan is giving out gifts. She's so generous. The common folk followed Zhuo Qingluan's team in great excitement. Chaoga asked the teenager next to her, What gifts? The teenager said, Do you not know? Miss Qingluan has come back. Do you see all the magpies? Chaoga said, Yes, I know that. The teenager said, Each magpie has a red envelope in its beak, and they're dropping them from time to time. That's why we're all following her carriage. Chowga said sarcastically, that's so generous of Zhuo Qingluan. She's even more lavish than His Majesty. The teenagers stared at Chowga. It's not like that. Miss Qingluan has been cultivating in seclusion in Firmament Palace for 5 years. She shouldn't sneak into the city, should she? She's not like Feng Wu. Chowga said, what's that supposed to mean? The teenager was obviously a fan of Zhuo Qingluan. Hearing her tone, he glared at her and wouldn't answer. What's your name? Chowga decided to remember his name. I'm Xuezi. Chowga said, what did you say about Feng Wu? What's wrong with her? She's great. Xuezi said, even so, the crown prince is still going to marry Miss Qingluan. Chowga wouldn't have it. Nope. The crown prince is going to marry Xiao Wu. Xuezi gave Chowga a contemptuous look before looking away. Chowga didn't like his attitude. What's that look in your eyes? Contempt, Xuezi said directly. Chowga grabbed him by the sleeve. Xiao Wu is so much better than Zhuo Qingluan. She's the one His Royal Highness is going to marry. Chowga didn't like the idea of Feng Wu being involved with Jun Linyuan, but she didn't like losing to Zhuo Qingluan either. Xuezi glanced at her and grumbled, His Royal Highness has to be blind. Chowga said, you! There. Feng Wu patted her. Be quiet and watch the show. Chowga was so frustrated. She thought, His Royal Highness likes Xiao Wu so much. You'll see. Just then, someone shouted, the envelopes are raining down again. Chapter 2395, Untitled. Chapter 2395, Untitled. Catch them. Catch them. This way, please. The crowd was in a frantic mood. Everyone was bumping into everyone, and Feng Wu was almost shoved to the ground. She grabbed Chowga and jumped onto the roof of a house, where things were quieter. But the roofs weren't deserted either. In fact, to catch the envelopes, many people were climbing up to the roofs as they spoke. What's in the envelopes? Why are they so excited? Chowga snapped. That Zhuo Qingluan just has to let everyone know that she's back. That's so pretentious. While Chowga was venting her sarcasm inwardly, a middle-aged woman nearby said, Kiddo, what are you talking about? Aren't you excited? She was quite lucky. There were already 3 or 4 envelopes in her hands. There's everything in these envelopes. Look, this one says 50 copper coins. That's good. The woman showed Chowga the content. Take it to the shop of the Zhuo family on East Avenue, and they'll cash it out for you. 50 copper coins? Chowga rolled her eyes. That's not very generous. The woman didn't agree. It's now my luckiest day. The luckier ones will have vouchers for silver in their envelope. I hear someone found 100 taels of silver in theirs. I do hope I can find the top prize. It's supposed to be a house. Here in the imperial capital. Chowga said angrily, she's bribing everyone. The woman didn't think much of it. I wish there were more people like her. Chowga was so angry that she didn't know what to say. Meanwhile, up in the air, Zhuo Qingluan was sitting in the phoenix carriage, and next to her was Tongke, her maid. Tongke held a gilded envelope in her hand, which was none other than the top prize for today. It was a courtyard worth a small fortune here in the imperial capital. Tongke was very satisfied with her design of the event. She had sent out word in advance that Miss Qingluan was coming back today and would be giving out gifts. As expected, many people showed up. Their carriage wasn't very high up, so Tongke soon saw the people standing on the rooftop. Although it had been 5 years, Tongke immediately recognized Feng Wu and Chowga. Miss Qingluan, look. Tongke pointed in the direction of Feng Wu and Chowga. Zhuo Qingluan had been resting her mind with her eyes closed. She was displeased when Tongke disturbed her, but she still looked in that direction. From hundreds of meters away, she spotted her archenemy right away. Miss Qingluan, that's Feng Wu, right? Tongke sounded excited. She must know that we're giving out gifts. How hard must her life be? She's waiting for our handouts. The two girls were known as the two genius girls of the imperial capital 5 years ago. But now, Zhou Qingluan was high up in the carriage, and Feng Wu was supposed to be a nobody who had lost all her abilities. Chapter 2396, Untitled. Chapter 2396, Untitled. Zhou Qingluan's face darkened a little when Tongke mentioned Feng Wu. She followed the direction Tongke was pointing in. A slender girl in a red dress stood on a rooftop. It was impossible to miss her despite the large crowd. Seeing Zhou Qingluan's frown, Tongke suddenly had an idea. She threw out the envelope in her hand. Unlike the other envelopes, this one was gilded and looked spectacular. It flew right in Feng Wu's direction. It's her lucky day. That's a big house that comes with a courtyard, Tongke said arrogantly as she looked down at Feng Wu. She decided that people would look down upon Feng Wu as well if she accepted this gift with great excitement. Zhou Qingluan gave Tongke a sideway glance and shook her head. She's a nobody. Why bother? Tongke was baffled. Zhou Qingluan raised her chin, looking as proud as an empress. She's as common as everyone else. Paying attention to her is the same as complimenting her. Tongke immediately slapped herself and said, I'm sorry, Miss Qingluan. Zhou Qingluan asked contemptuously, What are you sorry for? Tongke said, You've defeated her for good, so she isn't worth your attention. No, even I shouldn't pay any attention to her. Zhou Qingluan nodded. If you dislike someone, it means that you still care about them. I, on the other hand, ignore Feng Wu completely. Tongke immediately nodded. Yes, Miss Qingluan. Zhou Qingluan kept her head up and never lowered her gaze. Soon, the phoenix carriage disappeared from sight. Why is she leaving so soon? I didn't even get to take a look at her. Shuizi's tone was filled with regret. The middle-aged woman felt sorry to see Zhou Qingluan leave as well. No more gift. What a shame. Just then, they saw the gilded envelope. It was obviously headed for Feng Wu. Feng Wu looked at the carriage, and could sense Zhou Qingluan's mocking. Xiao Wu. Chaoga was surprised when Feng Wu caught the envelope. Everyone else looked at her enviously. They all could tell that it was a very special gift. Xiao Wu, that's... Chaoga realized that the envelope had been given to Feng Wu on purpose, and she was furious. She shouted, She means to humiliate you. Xiao Wu, you can't take it. She wanted to tear it up. There were so many people around, and if word got out that Feng Wu had accepted Zhou Qingluan's house as a gift. 5 years ago, Feng Wu used to be mentioned alongside Zhou Qingluan. Some people still compared the two of them now. Right now, that envelope could bring her a lot of trouble. Is that the special prize? Shuizi immediately recognized the envelope. The special prize? Do you mean the top prize? The house. The middle-aged woman was exceptionally loud. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.